Here's a third implication of creatio ex nihilo, and I'm happy to have a Franciscan next to me as I say it. The interconnectedness of all created things. How St. Francis loved that idea, how he celebrated it. But you think for a second, if you follow Merton in contemplative prayer and you find the place in you where you are here and now being created by God, what have you found? You found the place where you are here and now being created by God, and where you are here and now being created by God, and where brother sun and sister moon are here and now being created by God. Francis is not just, whistling Dixie there or engaging in nice little poetry. That's good, solid metaphysics to speak of brother sun and sister moon, that we are connected to each other by the deepest bonds, that we're a bit like an archipelago, right, that looks separate on the surface, but when you go down deep, you find it's all coming from the same place. That's a Christian vision of the world. How our ethical lives would utterly change if we really believed it, right? If we really took it seriously, how everything would change. That's an implication of creatio ex nihilo. Think of those beautiful rose windows. I fell in love with them when I was in France. Those great circles of light and color. But the idea is that the center is Christ. It's always Christ in the middle. And then wheeling around him are all the different elements of the window. Well, see, that's meant to be the cosmos. That's the world. That at the center is the Creator God. And then everything is connected by spokes to that center. And thereby to each other. That's a picture of the well-ordered cosmos. How fractured our world becomes when we forget this doctrine. Okay. How about a last one? Then I promise I'll bring it to a close. Here's a final feature of the icon of Christ, who's the lens by which we see the nature of reality. We're squinting through that lens to see how things really are. Here's the last bit. What the theologians of the 20th century called the Paschal mystery, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I've been looking a little bit more abstractly at Jesus, but now we'll bring the focus in and look at his life, death, and resurrection. And I'll say just a few simple things about this. What was Jesus about? What was he trying to do? Here's one way to look at it. The Mashiach, if you look in the prophets and the Psalms especially, the Messiah, the new David, the anointed one, had a pretty clear job description. The Mashiach was meant to gather the tribes of Israel. He was meant to cleanse the great temple. He was meant to deal with the enemies of Israel. And then finally he was meant to reign as Lord of the nations. Again, I'm distilling that from the prophets and the Psalms and many other sources. That's what people expected of the Mashiach. How wonderful, how startling that the first Christians call him Yeshua Mashiach, right? Jesus the Anointed One. Jesus Christos in Paul's Greek, Jesus Christ. Yeshua Mashiach, the anointed Jesus. They meant he accomplished those four things. Gathering the tribes. Look at everything I've been talking about. God's non-competitive transcendence, creatio ex nihilo, the rose window, non-violence, that we are meant to co-inhere. See, that's the vision. That's the biblical vision. What's happened is we fell apart through sin, violence, drove us apart from each other. What was God's plan now in the Bible? It was a rescue operation. It was a rescue plan. The means he chose was a people Israel. Israel, in the unity of its praise, learning the mind and heart of God, would now serve a magnetic purpose. They would gather the tribes of the world back to God. Mount Zion, true pole of the earth, the psalmist says. There all the tribes go up, Isaiah says, the tribes of the Lord. See, the idea is Zion, where Israel worshipped, would become the magnetic place where all the tribes of the world would be gathered together like a great rose window. Watch Jesus' ministry now. It's an in-gathering ministry. It's a gathering in. Jesus' open table fellowship. All the contemporary scholars talk about that. Saints and sinners, the insiders, the outsiders, the ups, the downs, everybody welcome at his table. Look at Jesus going out to the woman at the well, to the man born blind, to Zacchaeus, gathering in those who had been sent to the margins. The night before he dies, he gathers on Mount Zion, true pole of the earth, with his 12 disciples, evocative of the 12 tribes, gathering them in. Cleansing the temple. The temple, that's what was on top of Mount Zion. The place of right praise. Do you see how that's the way the rose window comes together? When Israel praises God aright, they become united. And their praise was meant to be so compelling that the whole world will be drawn to it. The trouble is the temple had become corrupt. And so all the prophets call for the cleansing of the temple. Look at Jesus now. In reference to himself, you have a greater than the temple here. His own person now becomes the place of right praise. People come to him to be healed, to have their sins forgiven, to learn how to pray. And that's why at the climax of his life, he goes into the Jerusalem temple. He cleanses it and then pronounces judgment upon it. This place will be torn down, and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. What's he talking about? But the temple, John tells us, of his body. He himself becomes the place of right praise. Dealing with the enemies of Israel, that was the task of the Mashiach. Think of David the warrior, all the great warrior kings of Israel. Is Jesus in that tradition? Yeah, in one sense. But what a strange warrior he is. I have the cross here, right? Right above me. That we put that up here is just deeply weird. Imagine how someone coming from the ancient world in a time machine to this gathering, and here we are, it's a religious talk, and for religious purposes in this sacred room, we have a Roman cross? Are you people out of your minds? That terrified people in the ancient world. The cross was state-sponsored terrorism. It was so horrific that even the greatest orators and poets at the time wouldn't talk about it. We speak of excruciating pain, right? Ex cruce, from the cross. We'll put you on this instrument of torture, we'll leave you there till you die, and then the scavenging animals will pick apart your body. That's what the cross meant. That's where the enemies of Jesus put him. Peter says, the author of life came and you killed him. Extraordinary, isn't it? The Logos comes into our flesh and we killed him. That, by the way, tells you something. Whenever we're tempted to say, I'm okay and you're okay, we hold up the cross to say, no, we're not. Oh, we're basically fine. No, we are not. The author of life came and we killed him. How did Jesus deal with the enemies of Israel? Oh, if only he were a Davidic king, he would have fought them to the death. Rather, on that terrible instrument of torture, he allowed all the dysfunction of the world to come at him. Think of those passion narratives we read at Easter time, right? During the Holy Week. Stupidity, hatred, cruelty, violence, injustice, betrayal, denial. See, it's as though every form of human dysfunction came at him. How did he fight it? Not with the weapons of the world, but rather allowed it to wash over him. And then he swallowed it up in the ever greater divine mercy. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. See how that word from the cross is the moment when the battle is won. When the Mashiach, the Anointed One, dealt with the enemies of Israel. And then he reigns as Lord of the nations. How beautiful that Pilate put on that cross a sign, right? Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And lest anybody miss it, he put it in Greek too and Hebrew. Pilate becoming thereby the first evangelist, announcing the kingship of Jesus to all the nations. How does he know Jesus is the king? Because God raised him from the dead. Not a myth, not a symbol, not a literary device. But Jesus, in his bodily resurrection from the dead, shows what? What? That God's love is greater than anything that is in the world. See, why can Paul say, I'm certain that neither death nor life, neither angels nor principalities, neither height nor depth, or any other creature could ever separate us from the love of God. Paul knows it because we killed God. And yet God returned in forgiving love, swallowing up thereby the dysfunction of the world. And that's why the same Paul could say, as he careened around the world that he knew, Jesus Kyrios. Jesus Kyrios. See, but we say, yeah, Jesus is the Lord. This nice, pious, spiritual thing to say. But see, those are fighting words in Paul's time. Because what people said to each other in the Roman world was, Kaiser Kyrios. Caesar's the Lord. You see what Paul's doing, how provocative he was. No, not Kaiser Kyrios, Jesus Kyrios. Jesus is the Lord. Meaning he's the king to whom final allegiance is due. You see why Paul spent a lot of time in jail? See, because they knew exactly what he was saying and how subversive it was and still is. See, what's our myth? Again, from ancient times to now. Order comes through violence. That's what the cross meant. That's the old myth. You cross us, pun intended, we'll do that to you. We'll restore order through violence. God's love is greater than anything that's in the world. God's love, nonviolent love, is the means by which order is restored. That's how the temple is cleansed. We see the cross as an altar where a sacrifice is made. That's where the tribes are gathered. When the Son of Man is lifted up, he means the cross, I will draw all people to myself. You see how the messiahship of Jesus is what the first Christians proclaimed. It's what we still proclaim to this day. It's a decisive element of this great icon by which we read the whole world. Okay, let me bring it to a close right there with those four dimensions. And I hope what you see is the coming together of the highest, most abstract kind of metaphysical reflection in our tradition. But it's conditioned by this first century Jew, this Jesus of Nazareth, who died on that terrible Roman cross, but whom God raised from the dead. It's from that perspective that the whole Christian view of life emerges. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.